your toes outnumber your teeth. That's the golden years. When the daily double is prune juice and an enema, that's the golden years.
You're talking your basic golden years,
Basic golden years. That's good. Basic golden years. That's good. Yeah.
Have you, just a transitional phrase there.
I know.
Have you seen your doctor lately?
I can't get my pocket back. I got the pocket back, right?
Okay.
Oh, boy.
Have you seen
When you get older. When you get older, you know, they say the first thing that goes is the mind. I said he missed by 3 feet, you know that?
Good morning. It's Saturday, Enemies of My Country Saturday, April the 27th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and the enemies of my country. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
And borrows its title from our sacred motto, Semper Fidelis.
Thank you. Now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
By contrast, human action, to use the Austrian economic term, is not merely reactive to constraints and utility functions, but active and creative, the exercise of the free and creative, and some of us think God-given will that can say yes or no. Deirdre N. McCloskey. Embedded in human action, because it reflects the image of the Creator, is creativity and freedom. This transcends the robotic and instinctive reactions that are needed for us to function and adds a dimension that not only feeds economic life, but also feeds our souls.
And that was the 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen, No Free Lunch. Back in a minute.
Who famously advised a commander to get thar fustest with the mostest. It must be true. I read it in the New York Times in 1917. Online. Forrest, by the way, was also one of the first leaders of the Ku Klux Klan, which means he would be right at home in today's Democratic Party, just as he was back then. And just when we think we finally put one scurrilous charge to rest, move the goalposts and accuse us of something else. Endless fun and an all-purpose debating technique as well. So call us out. But whatever you do, please don't. 3, label us. We hate labels. We especially hate them when they are applied to us. Labels are sticky and tough to get off. They're what we do to you, with our media shills always willing to apply an extra coat of stickum, probably left over from those old glue pots they used to use to paste their stories together back in the good old days, when teletype machines ruled the earth and you could trust what you read in the newspaper, instead of the seditious crap you see on the internet today. And please, pretty please, never, 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 4, mock us. Because if you could see us as I do, interior Beverly Hills, night. A modest, private, 24,000 square foot home on one of the less fashionable streets above Sunset. Red-jacketed, suspiciously Mexican-looking valets take temporary possession of an array of late-model, expensive, but certifiably green cars. Our hero and main character, David Kahane, an incredibly handsome and talented young man who looks like a cross between Cary Grant and Albert Einstein, pulls up in a new Toyota Prius. The valet is impressed as he takes the keys. Interior mini mansion, Beverly Hills, night. A swan-necked hostess wearing a form-hugging little black dress greets Dave with a kiss and a glass of champagne. Her name is Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa. David, darling, it's grand of you to come. Conspiratorially, I'd better lock this joint before the acrobats and midgets start flocking in. Dave. Stop running old lines from Gold Diggers of 1933. Rosa. But my darling, that's the only movie I know. Come in, join us. We're all here. Vlad, Brad, and Dangerous to Know. Ha 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 ha. Dave, chucking her under the chin in a friendly but sexy way. You always were a kidder, kiddo. Interior mini mansion, Beverly Hills, continuous. Dave smiles as he enters the dining room, which is about the size of Soldier Field in Chicago. There must be 50 tables of 6 in the modest room, with a view of the Hollywood Hills, Century City, and the Olympic-sized pool out the French doors. Over the Walla Walla, Dave greets the other Hollywood celebrities in attendance. At last, Dave comes to his table. Cut to interior dining room later. The aftermath of the meal. Dave's table. A buxom starlet who's obviously had a little too much to drink speaks up. Buxom starlet. So, what do we think? About how well everything is going, I mean. Silence greets her query. She giggles, embarrassed. Buxom starlet. Did I say something wrong? Dave looks over at her, likes what he sees, decides to go for it. Dave. I agree with what's-her-name. What more could we ask for? We've gotten just about everything we wanted, and if you don't believe me, just ask my sainted father, Che Kahane. Querulous guest number 1, rival agent. But there's so much more. Querulous guest number 2, former studio chief. The work is never done. The dream shall never die. The fight goes on. Whatever. Yada yada. Querulous guest number 3, major producer. Frankly, the thing that worries me is the Christian right. Dave glances over at his agent, who's seated across the way. The agent avoids his glance, pretends not to know him. Dave turns to a little guy on his left, a stranger. Shabbily dressed with bad teeth, the guy is obviously a fellow writer. Dave, what do you think? Fellow writer, what do I think? I'll tell you what I think. I think you're all a bunch of prats. Wankers who don't know how good you've got it. This being a movie, his remarks come at a moment of complete silence in the room, so everybody hears every word. A seething undercurrent of fear and rage ripples through the crowd. Murmurs of "kill him" can be vaguely discerned. Undaunted, the fellow writer continues. Fellow writer continued. I mean, here you sit, expostulating, bloviating, ejaculating, and generally fannying about.
And that was the next part of Chapter 21 from Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left.
Rule 38. Under no circumstances let radicals control the rules of the game. If an active participant in a game were able to set the game's rules in real time, and if he were at the same time an unscrupulous man, in his zeal to win he'd certainly concoct rules favorable to himself, all but ensuring his victory. Unilateral power to set rules imbues the rule-maker with godlike invincibility. Scenarios such as these are thinly veiled Calvin Ball, the game from Calvin and Hobbes, where the main character Calvin initiates an endless series of rule changes, all designed to set himself up to win. In war, you don't let your enemy dictate the terms of the battle to you. If you want to give yourself the best chance of achieving victory, you fight on your own terms. If possible, you don't fight in the enemy's chosen setting. You fight on your own terrain. You don't fight with weapons favored by the enemy. You fight with the weapons he fears most. You don't fight him at a time when he expects it. You fight him at the time he least expects it. You don't fight with tactics the enemy prefers. You fight him with tactics of which he's ignorant. Radicals have long been dictating to conservatives our rules of engagement, the rules controlling the outcome of our battle. Radicals have made a habit out of dictating those topics which are acceptable in public discourse. Through the bludgeon of political correctness, they've assumed the power to tell us what language we can use and what language we can't use when describing a problem. We can no longer speak our minds with clear diction. Instead, we're told to use muddled niceties out of sensitivity to the feelings of an ostensible victim class. Yet radicals can spew vitriol at retrogrades with impunity. Under the present Calvin Ball regime, for radicals, dissent against an unfavored administration is patriotic. On the other hand, when retrogrades dissent against an administration favored by radicals, it's an affront to the dignity of the office. Radicals can stage sit-ins and occupy vast areas of critical urban centers for weeks at a time to protest income inequality, but retrogrades must have a buffer zone to pray in front of abortion clinics. Radicals are free to hold gay pride parades in any locale in the nation, but retrogrades have to fight tooth and nail to get a permit for a straight pride parade in one city. Bigotry against Christians and Jews is openly embraced by radicals. Yet, if a retrograde so much as hints that Islam may be prone to violence, they are branded as hateful and Islamophobic. In fact, any time a retrograde reproaches some evil that radicals favor, we're called phobic for doing so, e.g. homophobic, Islamophobic, fatphobic, transphobic, and xenophobic. Retrogrades have allowed ourselves to be hapless victims of bullying for too long, acting like the overly passive friend who knows his peer is cheating at a board game, but does nothing about it. This paradigm must be altered, and it must be altered fast. If retrogrades are to prevail in the ongoing political cultural war, we cannot resign ourselves to sheepishness in the face of radical imperiousness. There's nothing to stop us from insisting on our own set of rules. And when radicals are forced to play on our turf, let's see who prevails.
And that was Rule 38 from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by David and Timothy Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
While that means we're culturally holding on for dear life here in the short run, if we can hold on long enough and play our cards right in the long-term future, there is a potential for a major American Renaissance revival here. The emerging generation is poised to begin the three-generation cycle all over again. The only question is, what meta-theme or transcendent truths will they embrace and pass on from here? We've got a shot to restore the Republic, but we've only got one shot. In light of that, I've got some good news and some bad news. The good news is that emerging generation is all but a blank slate, believing in nothing. The bad news is we're not currently equipped to fill in the blanks for them. We're now the counterculture, and the left is now the man keeping them down. It's becoming passé to have sex with anything you want, short of a car battery, getting stoned every day that ends in Y, and knowing nothing. That used to be cool and considered some existential statement about refusing to be a cog in the machine, but now it's a cliche. Even raunchy comedy movies like Knocked Up have an underlying theme paying homage to some vestige of the Judeo-Christian moral ethic. If you want to challenge the status quo in this era, you get and keep a job, pay your own way, stay married to the same person from the opposite gender until one or both of you die, have a lot of kids, and go to church. In other words, the 1950s is now considered edgy. The more hopeless it becomes, the more conditions on the ground in this culture are ripe for revival. Human nature craves complacency. As someone that has lost almost 100 pounds, I can personally vouch for this. I could talk all I wanted about getting healthy, but only when I was sick and tired of being sick and tired did I truly commit to the change that was necessary. Otherwise, if we can kick the can down the road, we will. Along those lines, when faced with national fiscal insolvency, a generation's basic survival instinct takes over. This explains why Ron Paul, an almost octogenarian whose quirky stage presence makes Ross Perot look like Cary Grant, was one of the only Republicans in America successfully wooing young voters when he retired in 2012, despite the fact several of his domestic policy proposals are perhaps the most radically right-wing in the GOP. Those younger voters are looking at a bleak future and are rejecting the premise they have an obligation to accept the burden of the previous generation's inability or unwillingness to practice self-control or govern itself. On the other hand, elderly voters who belong to AARP no longer buy green bananas, let alone worry about what shape the country is in 20 years from now. They're voting based on maximizing their welfare state cash value now. However, we will not be able to reach this emerging generation and position this country for a long-term rebound without obeying the 7th of my 10 commandments of political warfare. Define your opponent before they define themselves, and define yourself before your opponent defines you. Almost all of the terminology we take for granted our culture has redefined, to the point the emerging generations are ignorant of what we're talking about. They have become living, breathing examples of the Hegelian dialectic, which is when the thesis, the argument, and its antithesis, counter-argument, end up merging into a synthesis, the narrative, and they become virtually indistinguishable from one another. I see this when dealing with the liberal media, whom I've had a lot of interaction with the past couple of years as someone interviewed on presidential politics frequently. Older liberal reporters are Watergate-era ideologues, naturally suspicious of conservatives and Republicans. However, when I've dealt with younger members of the liberal media, I see a completely different level of bias. While their elders have rejected what conservatives believe, the next generation is totally ignorant of it. They have been so indoctrinated into a secular progressive worldview that the idea of someone like me, who can articulate a cogent thought and still believe Jesus Christ physically rose from the dead, just doesn't compute. I am a foreign concept to them. They talk to me inquisitively, almost like they're saying, wow, these things do exist, and we get to observe one of them in its natural habitat. Let me provide three examples. Older liberal media use the term pro-choice to describe those in favor of child killing. Younger liberal media now uses the term reproductive freedom. Older liberal media use the terms gay marriage or same-sex marriage to describe two people of the same gender committing to a monogamous relationship and having it recognized by the state with the same prominence as marriage. Younger liberal media now uses the term marriage equality. Older liberal media used phrases like making the wealthy pay their fair share to play class warfare. Younger liberal media now goes straight up socialist with the term income equality. Younger liberal media uses phrases that leave no room for discussion, let alone debate. They are operating under the assumption that those questions have been settled, so considering other points of view is unnecessary since there aren't any that are valid anyway. I've had many of them flat out tell me I forfeit my right to free speech and religious liberty if I disagree with redefining marriage since I'm now a bigot and bigots don't have rights. This, of course, is extremist language coming from those who call us extremists.
And that was the next part of Chapter 10, Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again, by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Daily Law for April 27th.
April 27th. Despise the free lunch. The powerful never forget that what is offered for free is inevitably a trick. Friends who offer favors without asking for payment will later want something far dearer than the money you would have paid them. The bargain has hidden problems, both material and psychological. What has worth is worth paying for. By paying your own way, you stay clear of gratitude, guilt, and deceit. It is also often wise to pay the full price. There is no cutting corners with excellence. Daily Law. Learn to pay and to pay well. The 48 Laws of Power, Law 40. Despise the free lunch.
And that was the Daily Law for April 27th from the Daily Laws by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
Many of us are familiar with the phenomenon of addiction, whether it's alcohol or it's to drugs or it's to sex or pornography. All forms of sin are really forms of addiction. When you're caught in addiction, what can't you do? You can't save yourself from it, right? Think of the 12-step programs. The key move in all the 12-step programs is to admit your powerlessness and to turn your life over to a higher power. That's born of Christianity, everybody, that insight. If you say, look, I'm powerless over this addiction, and the more I try through my own efforts to make it right, the worse I'm going to make it. Turn your life over to a higher power. Only in that way are you going to be saved.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand Thought of the Day.
The truth which they refuse to face and to admit is that the world conflict of today is the last stage of the struggle between capitalism and socialism, and that the whole world knows it. The most helplessly ignorant shopkeeper on any corner of any street on earth knows it in his own simple terms, so he is unable to discuss political theory. Any illiterate peasant knows it in any Russian-occupied country when he dies fighting in desperate bewilderment for his right to his scraggly patch of soil. But our political and intellectual leaders are the only ones who pretend not to see and who go through the shabby ritual of promising mankind free speech, free factories, and free lunches, all to come from the American treasury, as if the masses of mankind were, in fact, the looting parasites of the socialist fancy.
And that was the Ayn Rand Thought of the Day. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now we pick up where we left off with the 33 strategies of war.
5. In April 1917, New York's Society of Independent Artists prepared for its first exhibition. This was to be a grand showcase of modern art, the largest in the United States to date. The exhibition was open to any artist who would join the society, whose dues were minimal, and the response had been overwhelming, with over 1,200 artists contributing over 2,000 pieces. The Society's board of directors included collectors like Walter Arensberg and artists like Man Ray and the 29-year-old Marcel Duchamp, a Frenchman then living in New York. It was Duchamp, as head of the hanging committee, who decided to make the exhibition radically democratic. He hung the works in alphabetical order, beginning with a letter drawn from a hat. The system led to cubist still lifes being hung next to traditional landscapes, amateur photographs, and the occasional lewd work by someone apparently insane. Some of the organizers loved this plan, others were disgusted and quit. A few days after the exhibition was to open, the Society received the strangest work so far: a urinal mounted on its back with the words R. Mutt, 1917, painted in large black letters on its rim. The work was called Fountain, and it was apparently submitted by a Mr. Mutt, along with the requisite membership fee. In viewing the piece for the first time, the painter George Bellows, a member of the Society's board, claimed it was indecent, and that the Society could not exhibit it. Arensberg disagreed. He said he could discern an interesting work of art in its shape and presentation. "This is what the whole exhibit is about," he told Bellows. "An opportunity to allow the artist to send in anything he chooses, for the artist to decide what is art, not someone else." Bellows was unmoved. Hours before the exhibition opened, the board met and voted by a slim margin not to show the piece. Arensberg and Duchamp immediately resigned. In newspaper articles reporting this controversy, the object was politely referred to as a bathroom fixture. It piqued a lot of curiosity, and an air of mystery pervaded the entire affair. At the time of the exhibition, Duchamp was one of a group of artists who published a magazine called The Blind Man. The magazine's second issue included a photograph of Fountain taken by the great photographer Alfred Stieglitz, who lit the urinal beautifully so that a shadow fell over it like a kind of veil, giving it a slightly religious appearance, along with something vaguely sexual in the arguably vaginal shape of the urinal when laid on its back. The Blind Man also ran an editorial, The Richard Mutt Case, that defended the work and criticized its exclusion from the show. Mr. Mutt's fountain is not immoral, no more than a bathtub is immoral. Whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, created a new thought for that object. It soon became clear that the creator of Fountain was none other than Duchamp. And over the years, the work began to assume a life of its own, even though it mysteriously disappeared from Stieglitz's studio and was never found again. For some reason, the photograph and the story of Fountain inspired endless ideas about art and art making. The work itself had strange powers to shock and compel. In 1953, the Sidney Janis Gallery, New York, was authorized by Duchamp to exhibit a replica of Fountain over its entrance door, a sprig of mistletoe emerging from the bowl. Soon, more replicas were appearing in galleries, retrospective exhibitions of Duchamp's work, and museum collections. Fountain became a fetish object, something to collect. Replicas of it have sold for over $1 million. Everyone seems to see what they want to see in the piece. Shown in museums, it often still outrages the public, some disturbed by the urinal itself, others by its presentation as art. Critics have written extended articles on the urinal with all kinds of interpretations. In staging Fountain, Duchamp was urinating on the art world. He was playing with notions of gender. The piece is an elaborate verbal pun, on and on. What some of the organizers of the 1917 show believed to be merely an indecent object unworthy of being considered art has somehow turned into one of the most controversial, scandalous, and analyzed works of the 20th century.
And that was the next part of the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. If you're a Democrat, you need to switch parties, become Republican, vote Republican, because everything the Democrats do backfires. For instance, pollution. The Democrats do things that guarantee that there's going to be an increase in pollution rather than a decrease in pollution. For instance, when they're doing road diets to make the roads smaller and narrower to get people out of their cars, instead, what's happening is that all these cars and buses are taking longer to get to their destinations. The longer they spend on the road, the more they pollute. Think about it. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the next chapter of The Enemies of My Country.
56. The hotel room in Fredericksburg was average in size, but under the circumstances, Worthy felt like it was claustrophobically small. He was seated on the lone armchair, surveying the team in their current resting places. Riley stretched out on one of the twin beds, Cancer on the other, both men looking like reflections of one another, with their arms folded behind their heads as they stared at the ceiling. David should have been sleeping, recovering from his long night on the run from the police. But he'd refused not only to sleep, but even to sit. So far, he'd been passing the time by pacing the room, making everyone nervous, his hollow stare becoming more so with each hour spent awake. "We should get tacos for dinner," Riley said to no one in particular. "And what the hell is Ian doing?" "Well," David responded, "he's either searching through intel at the team house, or he's halfway to Mexico and laughing his ass off. Either way, you're right. Tacos would really hit the spot." Cancer gave a long sigh. "If Ian doesn't have something for us soon, I might just drive back to Charlottesville and wring his scrawny neck. Hard to imagine that kid swam out of his dad's enormous balls." Sitting up to take a seat at the edge of the mattress, Riley replied, "You're still pissed about having to ditch your knife, aren't you?" "Course I am. Know how many people I killed with that thing? I was going to pass it down to my son one day." "Well, I lost 2 guns, including my grandfather's 1911, Riley pointed out, "and you don't even have a son, or a wife, or to my knowledge, even an ex-wife." Cancer looked hurt to his core, the first time Worthy had seen an indication of humanity in the team's second-in-command. He responded, "That's just fucking hurtful, man. Why would you say that?" David walked to the bedside and set a comforting hand atop Cancer's shoulder. "Cheer up, buddy," he said. "If Ian delivers, you'll have another chance to kill people again in no time. Just means you'll be using bullets this time is all." Some measure of hope returned to Cancer's eyes. "Thanks, David." Worthy wasn't sure what to make of the scene before him. Now that the team had gone rogue in direct violation of Duchess's orders and faced incarceration in the best-case scenario, it seemed everyone's maturity had regressed by a decade or 2. They'd spent nearly 8 hours in the hotel room, eating delivery food, watching movies, and shit-talking one another over the most minute trivialities, waiting for a no-notice raid on an objective that Ian had yet to find, without anyone mentioning the obvious. The world had shifted on its axis the second David had, in as many words, told Duchess to go fuck herself. They were disavowed, roving fugitives with a dwindling shelf life. And there was nothing they could say in their own defense. Their agency-issued weapons, ammo, and equipment were stockpiled in the 2 vehicles outside, and that infraction alone brought with it any amount of jail time that Duchess cared to threaten them with. Add in a couple dead bodies in the metalworking factory, and the fact that they'd driven an hour and a half in the hopes of some further lead to follow, and the sky was the limit with regard to how this Independence Day would end. But no one was discussing any of that, nor the somewhat glaring possibility that Ian's theory about a cell tower in Fredericksburg was wrong and had simply been a call relay like they used on their own phones. If that was the case, their time would be better spent trying to flee the country. When David's phone rang, it felt as if all the oxygen were sucked out of the room. Cancer and Riley bolted upright, and Worthy followed them to surround their team leader in a semicircle. David put the phone on speaker mode as he said, "Tell me you have some good news." Ian responded, "That depends on your definition of good. It wasn't easy, but I found a lead. The key was identifying a suspicious man overboard report from an offshore fishing boat." "Ian," David interrupted, "the clock is ticking. We just want breakfast. No one cares how the sausage was made." There was a pause then, and Worthy suspected it involved a moment of Ian fuming on the other end of the line. Finally, he said, "It's a seafood distribution facility, 12,000 square feet, and from what I can see, a lot of that is refrigerated processing and freezer space. The address is 204 Southern Avenue, 15 minutes away from your location." "We were going to get tacos for Riley, but I suppose we could head there instead. Push us all the imagery you can. We'll plan our raid on the move. At this point, I think we need to consider roping in Duchess." David shook his head. "We get shot up and killed. You call her and sing your heart out." "Concur," Cancer said. "We tell Duchess she's gonna send cops. Cops are bound by laws. We ain't." Riley shrugged. "But if she sends cops, we have time for tacos." David looked over and said, "Race gun, what do you think?" With a half smile, Worthy said, "What are we doing? Taking votes? No." "Tell me anyway. If I'm going to spend the rest of my life in a prison cell or a non-extradition treaty country, I want to go out with a bang. We've been hunting BK for too long to give up now. This isn't about who gets the kill, but out of everyone in the world, the only guys I trust to get the job done, no matter what, are in this room." "And me," Ian said, "back at the team house. Sure, whatever. Point is, I think there's a sufficient sense of urgency to justify anything and everything we can do, that we'll get more mileage out of extra legal measures than the feds would with all their oversight. We're already off the reservation. Let's make it count." Ian said, "You guys need to take it easy with the killing this time. The best thing you could do is capture some living detainees, especially BK. Finding out who put this operation together is as valuable as recovering the rockets." It was David who responded. "Ian, I love you. You're my brother. But there's a hard truth you still haven't learned about this business." "What's that?" David gave a patient smile before replying, his final response as the team made their way to the door. "Some people just need to get shot in the fucking face." 57. Ian's computer screens were filled with the live feed of every surveillance camera he could find around the seafood distribution center's perimeter. The internet was a magical thing. By penetrating the online networks of the adjacent businesses, he could view their live surveillance camera footage with only slightly less effort than it would have taken him to hijack a traffic camera in Tehran. But the pitfalls of his current position were many. The available cameras presented an incomplete view of the business park surrounding the objective building, and there was precious little he'd be able to tell the team that they couldn't see themselves in the next minute or two. Then came the matter of their communications. Ian was piping into the team frequency via a tenuous FM relay system that was already on the fritz, and he could only hear his teammates communicating between long, garbled bursts of static. They'd only received his return traffic intermittently, so their backup connection of cellular phones was going to be required sooner rather than later. And finally, there was Ian's own reservations about the mission at hand. He suspected the rockets were stockpiled in that building, awaiting departure the moment their launch system was ready to be loaded. It didn't make sense for the enemy to put all their eggs in one basket by combining the projectiles and launcher before they had to. That way, even if the launch system was interdicted by cops, they could relocate the rockets and await their next opportunity. Hell, they could lean the rockets against a rock and fire them whenever they pleased. Insurgents in the Middle East had been doing just that with varying degrees of success for years. But precision-engineered launch tubes would provide Barry Khan with near-pinpoint accuracy, and Ian doubted the terrorist would waste an opportunity like that. Whatever his target, Barry Khan was going to hit it with everything at his disposal. Ian felt a knot forming in the pit of his stomach, which could have been attributed to a bad feeling or simply his unease at not being physically present with his team. As unsuited as he was for purely tactical situations, the reality here was much worse. He was relegated to watching from afar, with an incomplete view assembled by a patchwork of adjacent surveillance cameras and without adequate communications. He wanted to be there, felt a deep, undeniable drive to speed to Fredericksburg and join his team. But his position in Charlottesville was simply too valuable. He was the last remaining line of support for the team, the only one who could sift any intelligence they found, since the agency was formally out of the picture. There was another reason, too, and it was one of insurance. Should the team be wiped out to a man in the operation ahead, Ian was the only one who could report their findings to Duchess in a last-ditch effort to stop Barry Khan. If he made that call too soon, she would flood the distribution center with police in an attempt to arrest his teammates. If he made the call too late, Barry Khan could slip through their fingers yet again. Ian shook his head. As if a second domestic assault operation weren't bad enough, he now had the legal ramifications of CIA blowback to consider. He caught a flash of movement on one of the screens, focusing in on it to see the unthinkable. A medium-duty delivery truck speeding into view from the distribution center's south side. Ian sensed at once that it was suspect, driving too quickly for the surroundings, running a stop sign between buildings as it careened down a side street and out of view. Even at the video screen's oblique angle, he made out the Blackwood Seafood Company logo on the driver's side door panel. Jesus, he thought, was that the attack platform? He didn't have time to perform the mental math in determining if a delivery truck of that size could fit the launch tubes for every rocket currently at large. But if it could, it would be brilliant. That delivery truck could fit on any road accessible to the average American sedan, and probably half of those were too narrow for a semi to traverse. Grabbing the hand mic, he transmitted over the team frequency through the relay. Stop movement, stop movement. 1 by delivery truck leaving objective to the north. Prepare for vehicle interdiction. How copy? The only response was a squelch of static, and Ian had no way of knowing if his transmission had been received, short of watching the screen before him. Then he saw that he was too late. 2 figures raced forward to initiate the assault. Ian's hand flew to the phone beside him and, hesitating for a split second of consideration, he picked it up and began to dial. 58. Cancer led the way to his designated breach point, with Riley following a few steps behind. He heard a burst of static over his earpiece and knew at once that it was Ian's dumbass on the ineffective FM relay. David transmitted back, "Angel, you're coming in broken. Clear the net." Cancer smiled at the response, thinking it was one of several oddities playing out in the current situation. For one thing, they were in full combat gear, night vision devices flipped upward on their mounts as they slipped past the security lights ringing the building. The sounds of traffic reached them from adjacent side streets as they moved with weapons at the ready, slipping toward their target amid a completely unsuspecting civilian population. Then came the matter of their plan, which could be briefly summarized as follows. There was no plan. How could there be? With a time-sensitive target and no interior layout, precious little planning was required. The distribution facility shared one border with a larger building containing an auto repair facility and, go figure, a seafood restaurant. Out of the facility's remaining 3 sides, all contained multiple loading docks, some for delivery trucks, but most large enough to accommodate 18-wheelers. Without sufficient personnel to isolate the objective, they'd have to rely on Ian to notify them of any squirters fleeing the building. And given the FM relay going to shit every 5 seconds, Cancer wrote that possibility off from the start. So the solution was simple. The team was going to take their chances, do what they'd always done, and play it fast and loose. Accordingly, the northeast wall would remain unguarded, while the southeast had a solid wall with the adjacent facilities. Cancer and Riley would enter through the southeast side of the building, while David and Worthy breached through the northwest. Once inside, both split-team elements would clear in a clockwise direction until they found the rockets or were killed. like he thought at the outset. Simple. Cantor darted up a set of concrete exterior stairs to a closed metal door, giving the handle a single short pull to confirm it was locked. The action was little more than a rote formality. No one was leaving the building unsecured, and as quickly as he registered the handle's resistance, Cantor took a side step and spun outward, scanning for targets in the parking lot as Riley moved in to apply the explosive charge to the door hinges. Taking in the sight before him, Cantor was both thrilled and mildly surprised to see that life was proceeding as normal in Fredericksburg. Parked cars and vehicle headlights proceeded up the roads in his line of sight. Even a few distant civilians made their way to the seafood restaurant at the far side of the building. No one looked up to see the two men in full tactical kit preparing to demolish a door before raiding the distribution facility, and even if they did, they'd likely have no idea what to make of it. It didn't matter, though. They'd become aware of what he could conservatively term a minor disturbance soon enough. "We're set," Riley whispered beside him. Cantor transmitted, "Team 2 ready." David's response was near immediate. "Stand by. 3, 2, 1. Execute, execute." The concussion of Riley detonating his door charge washed over Cantor in a single explosive shockwave that was followed by car alarms ringing to life in the parking lot, headlights and turn signals flashing in quick succession as his vision cleared from the blast. Then Cantor spun toward the now open doorway, raising his rifle as he darted inside and cut right to clear his first corner. 59. Duchess held the phone to her ear, feeling her lips slide into a smile, or was it a smirk, at the sound of the panicked voice on the other end of the call. Christmas had come early, she thought. Here she was, trying to track down David's team with the help of multiple local law enforcement organizations on top of the FBI, and the intelligence operative from her wayward assassination element had just personally dialed her office phone. With Gosweiler breathing down her neck over the previous night's raid in Charlottesville, Duchess wasn't just going to have these men arrested. She was going to crucify them. "Where are you?" she asked. "I want a location in the next 5 seconds, and if you're thinking about lying to me, know that you'll live to regret it." Ian replied, "Duchess, you've worked for the agency for a long time, and I respect your opinion." "Thank you," Ian continued. "Now stop talking and listen to what I'm telling you. There's a delivery truck with the Blackwood Seafood Company logo in Fredericksburg, Virginia, currently traveling northbound on U.S. Highway 1 and passing the Route 17 interchange. The odds of the rockets not being aboard are about 2%. Forget about arresting us for the time being and interdict this goddamn thing before it kicks off an attack we can't stop." The call ended then, a hollow click, followed by the sound of a man stating, "He ended the call, ma'am." "Yeah," Duchess said. "I got that." "Any updates?" the man asked. He wasn't inquiring about the content of the conversation. After all, he'd heard the exchange as clearly as she had, to say nothing of recording it for posterity. Rather, he was asking whether she took the conversation seriously enough to provide updated guidance to the law enforcement entities currently awaiting further orders. And that was a great goddamn question, she thought. David's team had strung her along quite enough in the past 4 days, starting with their illegal transport of agency equipment and ending with their current fugitive status. She knew good and well that this call could easily be the latest in a long line of diversions and half-truths. But the bottom line was that 633 rockets were at large, along with Bari Khan, and Duchess couldn't afford to take any chances. She replied, "Get me the Fredericksburg PD first, and the state police second. Tell them we have an emergency update requiring immediate response." 60. Worthy cleared his third doorway and cut left, sensing David entering the room behind him as both men scanned for threats and found none. While Worthy had never been inside a seafood distribution plant or anything close to it, his surroundings were about what he'd expect. Blue-painted metal staircases led to the second floor. Rolling assembly lines with power cords descended from the ceiling. Stainless steel tables and giant weighing scales interspersed with floor pallets were stacked high with boxes. The entire place was freezing cold, Worthy's thin Georgia blood feeling frigid in his veins, despite the effort of moving continuously under the weight of his full kit. Trolleys and hand carts were tucked against the little remaining wall space, obstacles he had to be careful not to trip over. Above all, the space smelled like ice and dead sea creatures, the scent filling his nostrils every angle he turned. They may as well have been clearing the interior of a giant lobster. There had been no trace of the rockets or even defensive measures in place to safeguard them, either from his element or the other split team. By all appearances, they'd just raided an empty building with the added complication of cops arriving at any second in response to what must have been numerous calls from concerned citizens reporting simultaneous explosions. Abandoned building and law enforcement response aside, Worthy had another concern. He was well enough versed in close-quarters battle to know his teammates' spoken and unspoken cues, and since he was paired with David yet again, he caught the sloppiness of motion indicative of lapses in alertness, or worse, judgment. Worthy could do nothing at present to correct either, and so he cleared his corners with all the rapidity that his experience endowed before hurriedly checking David's sectors, pulling double duty for lack of trust in his partner. Following David's lead, Worthy flowed into the next room, and it, like all the rest, was empty. Aside from the facility's lights being on, there were no indications of human presence whatsoever. As they closed on the next doorway, he whispered to David, "What do you make of this?" David replied, "Either Ian was wrong and sent us to a dry hole, or it's a trap." As if someone was trying to clarify the situation, a man began moving beyond the doorway to the next room. The first footfalls Worthy heard sounded distant, echoing against the cavernous walls as they approached and increasing in speed. Within a second, the noise of feet slapping the floor escalated to a run, not away, but toward them. Worthy flowed inside the next doorway, panning sideways to identify the runner, wondering if he was about to intercept some terrified factory worker sent fleeing by the other split team element. But the man he saw running at them from across a wide seafood processing room didn't look scared. He had Arab features and an athlete's focus, moving in a bulky cold-weather jacket as Worthy scanned him for weapons. His hands were balled into fists, with no visible firearm or even a knife. Worthy absorbed the sight within a fraction of a second, the only time he'd have to make a decision that could turn out to be the best one he'd ever made, or the worst. Aligning his sights on the man's face, Worthy fired a single suppressed gunshot that passed through the bridge of the man's nose, sending a spray of brain matter out the back of his skull as he tumbled forward. The unzipped seam of his jacket flew open to reveal a neatly aligned row of rectangular blocks, visible for a fleeting moment before the man struck the ground chest first. Ducking behind a metal rolling cabinet, Worthy transmitted in a feverishly urgent voice, "S-Best! S-Best!" He caught sight of David crouched behind a stack of boxes against the far wall, his transmission following Worthy's own by a fraction of a second. "Exfil, exfil, exfil!" Cancer replied, "Team 2 copies." Steadying his footing, Worthy prepared to cover his team leader's withdrawal and watched for David to make the first move back out the way they'd come. But against all logic, running wasn't on David's agenda at the moment. He was taking aim deeper into the processing room, firing his first shots of the mission. Keeping his body behind cover, Worthy angled his rifle around the side of the rolling cabinet to scan for a target. If another man was sprinting toward them, they may have only a moment to kill him before disintegrating in a jihadist fireball. But Worthy's next glance across the room didn't reveal a single target. It revealed at least a half dozen of them. As David fired beside him, Worthy drilled 2 rounds into the nearest man, sweeping his barrel right to engage a partially visible head emerging from behind a parked forklift. Worthy managed to fire 2 rounds in less than a second, a pink mist confirming his accuracy before he continued to sweep with a mounting sense of panic. The enemy fighters who suddenly appeared behind every possible object in the room may or may not have had suicide vests, but what they did have were firearms, and they began returning fire with deafening blasts as Worthy and David gunned them down as quickly as they appeared. But even with Worthy's uncanny reflexes, he feared it wouldn't be enough. These men weren't restrained to any logic of fire and maneuver, instead scrambling toward him across abundant covered positions provided by the processing equipment.
And that was chapter 57, 58, 59, and part of chapter 60 from The Enemies of My Country by Jason Casper. Next week, we continue with chapter 60. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.